So thank you for joining the event, filming the police or Film the Police, Countersurveillance and Community Activism. I'm Christian Rossipal, a filmmaker and PhD student at the Department of Cinema Studies at NYU. And I just want to say a few words before this event begins. And first, I want to thank the Cinema Studies Department for sponsoring this event. And in particular, I want to thank Ina Kajulis for her work setting this up. And this event is part of the department's fall event series, Rage, Reparation, Abolition. And the aim of this series is to serve the community at large by providing a platform for groups organizing around the current civil unrest and ongoing crises in the US and beyond. And the aim is not to show images of suffering, but to have screenings and speakers oriented towards activism and which enact, repair and re-envision social orders. Next Friday, for example, there's an event around Imagens or Images, a newly discovered Brazilian radical political film from the 70s, critiquing the brutality of the military dictatorship at the time. And there's more information about this event on the Cinema Studies website. And since this event today is presented by Cinema Studies at NYU in New York, I ask you to join me in acknowledging that we are on the unceded land of the Lenape and that NYU was founded upon exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples, including those on whose land this institution is located. And this is not meant as an acknowledgement to provide closure, but to indicate a commitment to begin the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. And if you're also located on this land here, consider supporting or getting involved with the American Indian Community House here in New York, the Lenape Center, the group Decolonize This Place, or the local indigenous community or nation where you're located. So a few practical things before I'll introduce Erin Gray, who is the moderator for this event. So we have first a late edition, which is a pre-recorded interview with Simone Brown. And after screening that, we'll hear from Portia Cobb and we'll see her short experimental film. And then we'll hear Palika Makam from Witness, and then Imani Jacqueline Brown from Forensic Architecture. And then we'll end with this final discussion. So if you have questions for the speakers, feel free to either ask them in the chat or put them in this Q&A box at the bottom. And finally, this event is being recorded and it will be available on the NYU Cinema Studies Vimeo page. Erin Gray is an assistant professor of Black Literary and Cultural Studies in the English department at UC Davis, where she writes and teaches at the intersections of critical theory and visual and performance studies to interrogate the aesthetic production of racist and anti-racist thought. Erin's current book project, The Moving Image of Lynching, Liberalizing Racial Terror in the Long Photographic Century, theorizes the co-emergence and continuing imbrication of lynch law and racial liberalism as constitutive elements of US imperial power. Her co-edited anthology, The Black Radical Tradition in the United States, is forthcoming from Verso Press next year. So Erin, if you're there.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm really excited to be joining Christian and our three presenters, Palika Makam, Portia Cobb, and Imani Jacqueline Brown, for our discussion tonight on filming the police, counter-surveillance, and community activism. So I'd like to begin my opening comments by acknowledging where I'm located today. I'm in Huichin, which is more commonly known by the settler name of Oakland, California. I want to give a shout out to Karina Gould, who is the spokesperson for the Confederated Villages of Lishan Ohlone, the first people of the lands in and around the Bay Area. Karina is co-founder of the urban indigenous women-led Sogorea Land Trust, as well as a co-founder of Indian People Organizing for Change. I think I just realized my PowerPoint's not working. Can you see the images that are on the screen?
Yes.
So you can. Okay, yeah. Great. So Karina is also a co-founder of Indian People Organizing for Change. And Ohlone people recently won a victory here in the Bay Area in the struggle to protect the West Berkeley Shell Mound from becoming the site of a multi-use development. The Shell Mound is an Ohlone historic village and sacred burial site that is over 5,700 years old. Last month, the National Trust for Historic Preservation named the West Berkeley Shell Mound site one of 11 of the most endangered historic places in the United States. So this is a real boon for local struggles around Indigenous sovereignty and land reclamation, you know, right at the kind of white hot center of gentrification in this country. And I want to thank Ohlone organizers for providing leadership and vision for building more sustainable relations and worlds. So I'm honored that Christian has invited me to moderate tonight's event on filming the police. I love learning and thinking alongside artists and activists. And I think it's more important than ever to be convening interdisciplinary makers and thinkers and organizers at the intersections of fields of inquiry and modes of creative practice as we undertake the kinds of challenging political education required of us to meet this historical moment as a potential opportunity for revolutionary world making. Tonight we'll be hearing from artist, media activist, storyteller, and professor Portia Cobb, Palika Makam, a media activist and the US Senior Program Coordinator at Witness, and artist, activist, and researcher Imani Jacqueline Brown, who is a member of Forensic Architecture. So before I introduce our first speaker, Christian is going to show a short film he made with media theorist and Black Studies scholar Simone Brown, whose 2015 book, Dark Matters, takes surveillance studies to task for erasing the conditions of Blackness in the frame. Brown roots biometric information technology in surveillance mechanisms instituted during the transatlantic slave trade. So technologies that were developed to track Blackness as property. Things like runaway notices, photographic carrying cards, slave passes, and branding. These were forms of identification and punishment that inform our present day so-called data revolution and the surveillance practices that are increasingly touted as progressive alternatives to things like cash bail. So, you know, as part of the current election on the California ballot, there's a proposition to end cash bail in California, but it replaces it with surveillance mechanisms that are quite pernicious. So I'll turn it over to Christian now.
Thank you, Erin. Yeah, I'll just say something very brief about the interview. So I recorded this with Simone in Austin in 2017. So it was obviously before George Floyd, before the events and unrest this year. So please keep that in mind. And it is part of a work in progress documentary. So it's the first time this interview is screened. And I hope you enjoy. And if you're interested in what she's talking about here, and she makes some crucial historical and structural connections to filming the police today and going back. this is in the book that Erin mentioned, Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness. So I highly recommend that book. So Ina, you could start the film.
Lantern laws were a set of laws that were put in place in New York City. You'll find them in the 1700s. And also, after the British evacuated, you have these laws that required that Black, mixed race, or mulatto at the time of the law, and indigenous enslaved people, if they were to travel around the city after dark and they weren't in the company of some white person, that it required that they would carry with them a lit lantern. And of course, what would happen if the lantern wasn't lit, or there wasn't that white person, or they didn't have enough lanterns for the amount of people? If people were found to be in violation of this law, they could be taken up and carried to the jail, subject to lashes. You see with that the way that light becomes a kind of disciplinary technology. You might think light's quite harmless. It's just, making people, humans, into basically the infrastructure of the city prior to electric streetlights or so. But it also is a means of creating kind of borders around who has a right to be walking in the street and who doesn't. And so that was the 1700s. You move forward, a few hundred years later, and you have something like what was called stop and frisk, the idea that the police can stop someone, for example, under the suspicion that they had committed a crime, under the suspicion that they were wearing clothes that were too baggy. People who might see a police officer and then turn around at the very sight of that police officer becomes a reason to stop that person, and then becomes a reason for a search. And so you see this idea of particular people's bodies being made vulnerable on city streets. No matter what the gesture was for Rodney King, he was still framed as aggressive, as a threat to the police at that moment. And so you have a citizen who filmed that interaction, all the baton blows that he was subject to. But yet, when it came time for the court case, and also in the mainstream media, Rodney King himself became framed as the aggressor. Every time he went to protect himself from the police blows, those then became read as attacks on the police. And so this is what the term that Butler calls the racially saturated field of visibility helps us to understand. The way that the anti-Black framing of that video is the way in which it is read, so that even if, rather before any gesture by King, or, for example, Corinne Gaines, who had the right to bear arms when the police came to her home to serve her with a warrant. She later recorded this standoff, and it was streamed to thousands via Facebook and Instagram. But yet she was still read as the aggressor in that moment. There are these calls that if we just have more cameras on police, then we'll be able to tell a different story of what is happening. But it doesn't change the racial framing, the anti-Black framing in which that story is told, in which those moments are recorded, and in which they're told again in cases of court or in the press. And so you have calls for police body cameras. You have calls for citizen-based or the public taking up their cell phones, their smartphones, and recording their own interactions with the police. And then you also have groups that are cop watch based, who watch the police, but also film themselves filming the police as a kind of security measure for how those interactions get told or narrated through that visual text. in terms of things like filming the police and cop watching, that I think is if we take the language of Steve Mann, that is surveillance, the idea of filming police undersight or filming from below, or those who don't necessarily stand in positions of power. But I think the questions that a lot of people are getting at is when you think about surveillance. When the video comes out, it's what realm is that read in? Does that really challenge the relations of power that in our contemporary moment are anti-Black?
Okay, so thank you, Christian, for conducting that interview with Simone Brown and for sharing it with us today. I'm just going to say a few words to unpack the some of the comments that Professor Brown makes in the interview. But before I turn to that, did you want to say anything else about the interview, Christian, or the larger project that this comes out of?
So the documentary is on countersurveillance and so-called cop watching or filming the police. And so, I mean, I think it's important to point out, and she does this brilliantly, but connecting the longer histories, but also if you're not familiar with cop watching, there are organizations that do cop watching, and most of them working today were founded in the wake of Rodney King. But even before that, there were different sorts of cop watchers using film cameras. And even before that, we could talk about other types of counter surveillance. But this is the larger project that the documentary is about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about cop watching and the kind of longer tradition of abolitionist counter surveillance in the United States. So I'm going to try to share my screen again. Not the most adept at the Zoom, but I think I've got it. Okay, so in her discussion of 18th century lantern laws in New York City, Brown argues that light becomes a disciplinary technology that marks, delimits, and exposes enslaved people as the hyper-vulnerable and internally excludable limit to public political personhood. Surveillance mechanisms like the lantern laws, of course, accompanied other formal measures for policing those who were enslaved in the antebellum United States. Southern slave relations were governed by the slave codes, which codified enslaved personhood as a heritable and hence racializable condition that barred its subject objects from rational humanity. In addition to defining slavery as a biological taint and Blackness as enslavability, US slave law only recognized human chattel as persons in the context of prosecuting so-called criminal acts on the part of the enslaved. So Black studies scholar Saidiya Hartman, in her book Scenes of Subjection, writes about the formation in slave law of Blackness as a form of criminal personhood that is only legible and perceptible as the agent or source of violence. So for those of you who haven't read Scenes of Subjection, I would recommend picking up a copy as soon as you can. I think it's probably the most one of the most important texts that's been published in the last 30 years, and really provides historical and theoretical background for understanding what's happening today and its relationship to the past. And so we see the ideological afterlife of this legal codification of enslaved personhood as a form of criminality in the early 1990s, when the corporate media and the LAPD's legal defense of LAPD's legal defense framed Rodney King as the source of the very violence the police had mobilized against him. And so it's important to underscore that the function of policing everywhere it is practiced is to frame anything that threatens the political economic interests of the ruling class as a form of insurgent violence, right? As irrational and illegitimate violence. The term police designates the state's right and duty to dispose threats to public welfare. So policing authorizes violence mobilized to protect the interests of the ruling class, right? So to boil it down to its most simplest, those interests are the accumulation of capital and the maintenance of political power, right? And so police authorize violence committed in the interest of maintaining those, the accumulation of capital and control over political institutions as reasonable, legitimate, and necessary. And as Brian Wagner notes in his book, Disturbing the Peace, the Anglo-American articulation of police power has been purposefully vague so as not to restrict or limit the force necessary to maintain this monopoly on public power. So as we keep in mind that the essence of police power is the discretion to use violence, right, not to protect citizens, policing is defined as the discretion to use violence, right, in order to enforce relations of exploitation and accumulation. It's also necessary to acknowledge that police don't always wear uniforms, that they are not always recognizable as official police. And this is especially true in the US, right? A country whose English colonial slave codes were not based on a comprehensive legal system. So the slave codes differed state by state. Of course, some of them were replicated across different states. But essentially, slave codes were lists of threats to public peace, potential threats to public peace, right? That could be, and these lists, these slave codes were amended as you know, state officials saw fit. And through the legal codification of Blackness as a criminal form of personhood, or sorry, though this codification of Blackness as a criminal form of personhood informs a kind of through line from slavery times to today, the definition of policing has been actually quite ambiguous in the US. So an example of how this ambiguity of the police power is actually a purposeful kind of measure, we can look at the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. The Fugitive Slave Bill of 1850 mandated that anyone who suspected a Black person of being a slave had to capture, arrest, and turn in that person to a local judge, right? So the bill provided monetary incentives, not only for those who were engaged in kidnapping people who were suspected of being enslavable. There was also monetary incentive for judicial authorities who were involved in the process, right? So judges, as well as just everyday lay people who were engaging in these acts of kidnapping, were actually paid to do this. The bill also established penalties for any person who impeded this process and narrowed the rights of any person alleged to have escaped slavery, right? So those who were captured didn't have habeas corpus rights. They had no right to due process. So this law, the Fugitive Slave Bill, along with post-emancipation Black codes, conscripted all white people into surveilling, monitoring, tracking, and punishing African and African descended people in the United States. So in the wake of the Civil War, of course, we have bands of white supremacist militias, not only gathering in public spaces. Here's an image of a group of red shirts doing poll intimidation, right? So this is happening right now. There are, you know, President Trump, 45, has called on his supporters to act as militia at the polls to defend the vote, right? And this is, of course, nothing new. There's a long tradition of white supremacist poll watching in this country, right? So we're looking at police here. These are red shirts, unofficial paramilitary operatives, right? In addition to gathering in public spaces and intimidating Black people and other people of color at the polls, white supremacists also entered into Black people's homes to police relations and movements and effectively make Black home life very difficult, if not impossible. Here's another image of poll intimidation happening. So framing, as Simone Brown states at the end of that interview, is incredibly important, and it determines how we learn to see the police, as well as misrecognize many policing functions. So I think important questions to keep in mind, you know, as we listen to our presenters today, and also just going forward as we continue the work of defunding police, abolishing police, is to really ask ourselves, what is policing? And who acts as police? The answers to these questions might not be as obvious or self-evident as we think. And I just want to mention that there has been a long tradition of abolitionist counter-surveillance. After the 1850 Fugitive Slave Bill was passed, you know, we see, slave owners, members of the master class at the time, circulated images like these, offering monetary rewards for the return of their property, their so-called property, and abolitionists responded by convening the first ever cop watching organizations. So David Ruggles was a writer, a Black writer and abolitionist in the 1830s, and he was cop watching. He was convening other abolitionists to effectively de-arrest people who were Black people who were being kidnapped and stolen and sent into slavery. So these are notices that abolitionists put out to warn people, to warn fugitive slaves, and as well as free and nominally free Black people and people of color, that they were at risk of being kidnapped. So we'll often hear that, we'll often hear that the first cop watch organization began in Berkeley in the 1990s, but actually began with abolitionists in, you know, around the 1830s. And David Ruggles established the first cop watching institution in New York City, and it then expanded to other major cities, Philadelphia, Boston, et cetera. And that formed the infrastructure for the Underground Railroad. So, you know, kids learning about the Underground Railroad seldom learn that it grew out of cop watching. And then, of course, you know, there's a long tradition of turning the camera back against people who have wielded cameras and different modes of visuality to punish Black people. So I just wanted to show images from a pamphlet that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee put together in the 1960s when they were engaging in Freedom Summer and working to organize voters in Mississippi. And there was, of course, a lot of state repression. Most of us are really familiar with MLK's campaigns in Birmingham and in Selma. And of course, Dr. King was very wise about the role of visual culture and understood that televising police aggression against nonviolent organizers would have, you know, a big impact on people's ability to understand the level of force and violence that is required to maintain a system of apartheid that we live under in the United States. So, you know, young organizers who were even critical of MLK, as many in SNCC were, understood the power of the visual. And there's an incredible archive of SNCC imagery. And these are just some images from, still images from a pamphlet that they put together after an attack from white supremacists in Danville, Virginia in 1963. So just to get us thinking about the kind of prehistory of filming the police, making video, moving images of policing, important to keep this early history in mind. So I'm going to turn it over to our presenters now. Let me get out of here. So we're going to be hearing first from Portia Cobb. Portia is an associate professor in the Department of Film, Video, Animation, and New Genres at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, as well as director of its Community Media Project, an arts incubator and workshop providing production training and access serving teens and young adults within Milwaukee's Central City. Portia's creative portfolio is a fusion of poetic documentary, photographic essay, and lore. She is deeply interested in themes that examine home, community, rooted identity, flight, flux, memory, and forced forgetting. Current work has explored collective histories of place and ongoing discoveries of her family's Villa Geechee genealogical heritage within coastal South Carolina. Thank you so much for joining us, Portia.
Thank you for the opportunity. This is wonderful to be able to share this piece that I made in 1992 and to have it still resonate with what is going on right now. To have students watch it through the lens of what is going on right now and seeing that those stories have not changed that much. Some people will look at the video and think of Rodney King as, or see the violence. And now we know that, with cameras added, which is really profound when you think about the person who is just focusing this camera, brand new camera, out of the window and happened upon that particular scene. So it's mind-blowing even now to think about that. Sometimes when I think about this and the title that I gave it, I realized that I was interrogating the media. It was an interrogation of what I was seeing and what we were hearing and how we were consuming it. So that's how it started with me. My question was, how is it that we can watch this violence day after day on television and just, kind of eat it with our cereal after a while and not feel anything or just be numbed by what we're seeing? So I think of it in contrast now to, George Floyd and how many times we saw the video and how it affected people. We're lucky to have had a document, just as, the Rodney King document became evidence that was shown in court, that became a court document. And I think it really revolutionized how we still have a long ways to go, but it's really interesting to look at that kind of surveillance then and now. So anyone, can I start? Just show it.
One 1,000, two 1,000s, three 1,000s, four 1,000s, five 1,000s. One 1,000s, two 1,000s, three 1,000s, four 1,000s, five 1,000s. One 1,000s, two 1,000s, three 1,000s, four 1,000s, five 1,000s. One 1,000s, two 1,000s, three 1,000s, four 1,000s, five 1,000s. One 1,000s, two 1,000s, three 1,000s, four 1,000s, five 1,000s. One 1,000s, two 1,000s, three 1,000s, four 1,000s, five 1,000s. 56 times in 81 seconds. 56 times in 81 seconds. Television. 56 times in 81 Multiply seconds. That 56 times in 81 seconds on television. 56 times in 81 seconds. 56 times in 81 seconds.
What do you feel about the recent sort of mediaization of police brutality and black men?
In 81 seconds on videotape. 56 times in 81 seconds the number of times on videotape. You saw it on television. 56 times in 81 seconds. 56 times in 81 seconds.
The whole intimidation factor of police behavior is a history of my lifestyle. So suddenly seeing it in a sensationalist version vis-a-vis LA and vis-a-vis the media, for me it's okay, yeah, we all know this and now you can see it in a really hard line view, but that doesn't change reality at all. I mean, these little pockets of, you know, fascist white supremacist bullshit go on, you know, and they're going to continue to go on in this kind of what we call majority culture. So what do you mean, what do I think?
Whenever these outside forces come in, the death rate among young black males go up. And I'm concerned about that.
That point of contention is unclear on the videotape. King then crumpled to the ground, Powell said, like a rag doll. The videotape goes out of focus. Powell testified that when he turned toward King, he saw King trying to get back up. Powell can be seen delivering a flurry of baton blows. Testimony indicated that King was on all fours, attempting to stand up. Powell said he was frantically trying to keep King down. When the video comes back into focus, 5 other officers can be seen in a semicircle around King, who's seen lying face down on the ground, but with his head up. One expert on the use of force testified that every blow past this point was excessive.
If we are being defined right now by how much we are oppressed, and that is wrong, I'm going to assume that that's wrong. We need to define our success by being able to change that reality right now. A teacher once said to me that power is the ability to define reality and to have others heed to that definition.
I don't really watch too much TV because, you know, they downgrade blacks a lot. And there's little things we don't catch, but, you know.
They're subtle.
Yeah, very, very subtle. And they do it in a roundabout way. Like, I'll give you an example, like Tarzan. He was a white man in the jungle, and he could beat a lion with his bare hands. And symbolically, to me, it's saying, well, the white man can defeat nature. And
so it's reinforcing
nature. Right. But see, we don't see that. See, like the black kids, they might see Tarzan and they think, oh, Tarzan, you know, hey, Tarzan. You know, and they see a white man defeating the blacks in a sense, you know, but they don't, it's subconscious. And so you're going to feel inferior to a white man. Because if you see a white man beating up a lion on TV and, you know, ruling over blacks in their own territory, then you're going to think that, well, I'm not, you know, you're going to think you're inferior.
The policemen just were not guilty of any abuse in our mind. They did simply what they were trained for, using the tools given to them, and based on Rodney King's actions.
5 1,000s.
He's the one that was controlling the action all the way through.
Seconds.
I feel that the police did only what they had to do in order to get him under control.
For most people, the video is all they needed to know about the Rodney King case, a beating beyond comprehension captured on tape for all to see.
It was just another piece of evidence that we had to look at. The parts that are shown repeatedly on the television are the parts that appear to be most violent. They show a limited amount of footage behind his head.
You know, that if there are 2 or more blacks in a car, they will pull you over. I've been pulled over numerous amount of times. You know, me and my friends just coming off playing basketball.
Get away to escape.
You know, they live in the area, and I'll be dropping them off at home and get pulled over for nothing, literally nothing. They just, you know, just checking us out, asking me where I'm from, where I'm going, and this and that. And, you know, it's hard.
2 1,000s, 3 1,000s, 4 1,000s, 5 1,000s, 1 1,000s, 2 1,000s, 3 1,000s, 4 1,000s, 5 1,000s, 1 1,000s, 2 1,000s, 3 1,000s, 4 1,000s, 5 1,000s, 1 1,000s, 2 1,000s, 3 1,000s, 4 1,000s, 5 1,000s, 1 1,000s, 2 1,000s, 3 1,000s, 4 1,000s, 5 1,000s, 1 1,000s, 2 1,000s.
The police in Alameda seem like it's the same white cop that keeps pulling me over. It's the same cop. No reason.
When you go to Alameda?
Just in Alameda.
Really?
It seems like it's the same cop. He done pulled me over at least 3 times before, but But I got put over about 7 or 8 times in Alameda, and 3 or 4 times it's been the same cop.
Really?
And he keeps saying he just pulling me over because they looking for somebody that fits my description.
Oh, really? And so what has he told you that description is?
He never told me. He just says...
He never says like it's a black male,
no,
your
he
age.
just says somebody, fit my description.
And there's no police presence down here. They will not enter the area. That's right. This is attempted murder. They're picking his pockets now. Okay, I think we just took a round. I think we just took... You see that? He's reaching up for help, and somebody kicked him in the head. Oh, look at that. Terrible. And there's no police presence down here. They will not enter the area. That's right. This is attempted murder.
What they scared of is a black man and a black woman educated about their own culture, knowing where they fit in this society, and prepared to make a change and suffer the consequences that it takes when you make a change. See, they're scared of that. They're scared of a black man with knowledge of self. They're scared of a black woman and a black man combined together, which creates power and unity. So that's why they rather see us in prison. That's why they rather see us in jail. That's why they rather see us separated away from our families than in school trying to learn and bring back to our community.
So the whole notion of white supremacy is still intact.
Oh yeah.
Oh yes.
We all are
definitely
victims of the white superiority. Because see, even white women, even white people that walk around, they're victims of it because they're influenced to, really not think about the less fortunate, or even from what they see on television, as blacks being portrayed very negatively. So we're all victims of it.
Said that King, who'd been shot twice with a stunning electric taser gun, was lying flat on the ground when, according to Powell, King suddenly rose to his feet and charged Officer Powell. Powell said he had no time to react.
I said a black male experience is to
ignited 6 days.
find a way to sort of rise up
34 people,
into the
28 of them
unity.
black, died.
In a sense where
150 blocks were destroyed.
it's like, a black man goes through a lot, and he experiences, like, with the police, like, I know you've seen, like, the things on LA and stuff like that, about the LA cops and stuff, but people just don't know that goes on all the time. And for me, personally, it's happened to me a lot, because I grew up in Hunters Point, and that's where, it was like a lot of a lot of police brutality, a lot of it. But we don't know it because it's in our own city and nobody ever filmed it.
1 1,000, 2 1,000s, 3 1,000s, 4 1,000s, 5 1,000s, 1 1,000s, 2 1,000s, 3 1,000s, 4 1,000s, 5 1,000s.
He continues to be racked by violence, the result of Wednesday's acquittal of 4 Los Angeles police officers who had been accused of beating Rodney King.
When it was over, the prosecution had failed to convince the jury that 81 seconds of videotape spoke for itself.
It's, for me, I have to be realistic. I have to look at myself, African American, 2, male, and 3, conscious.
The policemen just were not guilty of any abuse in our mind.
Khalid, Farrakhan, you ain't got that much time. Okay, I'll put it like this. White folks are afraid of genetic annihilation. They don't want to die out as a race. Therefore, they oppress black people, so we cannot reproduce. Because if we reproduce with them, we get black kids. If we reproduce alone, we get black kids. You have teen mothers having 3 and 4 and 5 kids. There's 3 and 4 and 5 black motherfuckers running around that they got to put in jail.
I know that I could summarize it in a matter a few abstract statements. So this is what the black male experience is. Should I start with my penis, or should I start with my hair, or should I start with my, my history? Should I start with my religion? Should I start with what? I mean, what should I start with to define this experience? I couldn't answer that question like 1, 2, 3.
Thank you so much, Portia.
You're welcome.
Multiply that by the number of times. 56 times in 81 seconds. Extract 56 times. Multiply 81 by the number of times. 56 you saw on television in 81 seconds. 56 multiply that by the 81 seconds you saw video on television. 56 times in 81 seconds on a videotape. 56 times in 81 seconds on videotape. 56 times in 81 seconds. 56 times in 81 seconds. 56 times in 81 seconds.
Thank you. When I look at this piece, what comes back to me is process a lot of times, and where I began, just by giving a platform to young Black males to talk about how they felt about being policed. And then the Rodney King event, although it was going on in the background, then came to a full head. And I decided to bridge those interviews with the current events at that time. Was sitting on the grassy knoll. One of the young men in the middle happens to be Boots Riley. At that time, he called himself Randy. And it was not until I went to studio to have the sound mixed in that the studio people told me who he was. Oh, you know of the coup? I said, no, I don't know of the coup. Do you know Boots? So it's been really a pleasure to revisit this piece. And earlier this week, I had him as a guest in my Black Radical class, and I played this moment for my students. And I told them he was 21 at the time. So it's really interesting to kind of, look back in time and realize that what they were saying was so present, and that they were very conscious, very aware, and maybe just, I see Oakland that way. And living in Oakland, that I felt like our finger was on the pulse. It had to be the entire time that, I lived there. One of the reasons I came there, and the stories that were told around that piece.
Yeah, it's really amazing to see you threading these interviews with these young men into the video, in and through the original video of the Rodney King beating, and really incorporating these young men's experiences into almost as an intervention, right, into the framing of the beating. And I think it's important to just note for our audience that you conducted these interviews at San Francisco State University, is that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so SF State, that was the site of the first Black Studies program. So, it was a site of militant movement building among students and young people and community members in the Bay Area. And so I think, we can really see the fruits of Black Studies in those interviews with those young men.
Yeah, they were definitely students of Asa Hilliard. And, so I can watch it and I can understand it that way. When I began to speak with them, I was just blown away. Um, the other thing that is interesting about the piece now, as I watch it in hindsight, is that it was actually a continuation of an earlier piece I did that was called Species in Danger Ed. And I kind of began with the same thing. And at that time, there was a lot of footage that was present of police beatings in Virginia Beach. And in my work, I started to kind of recycle news and audio from different things that were going on. So with the first piece, I think Species in Danger Ed, I did as a very short piece that was about 3 minutes long. And so by the time, No Justice, No Peace was born, it basically became a continuation or a diptych to that piece. But again, the questions are the things I was concerned with. And as I began to record people and becoming more comfortable with asking them questions, listening to them, and then, kind of widening the, my sampling. I didn't just stay on campus after a while. I did talk to other people. But, just kind of listening back to the audio. I have a radio, came out of radio right into film school. And so listening to the audio, everything I did really began with audio in the beginning. And then, then started to kind of source out imagery. So the audio was really important to me in hearing the testimonials of the jurors and the kind of clapback, you would call it now, of the men sitting on the knoll who are, basically we're listening to them, we're listening to their experiences. And yeah, I look back and I wrote some things down that I wanted to say about this piece. And I think it kind of speaks for itself. In my estimation now, when I look at it, I wish I had named it 56 times in 81 seconds, because it's so present. But I also think of it in contrast of 8 minutes, 46 seconds, that Dave Chappelle has, talked about. And I think of it as an essay style. And as I was editing it, the momentum did pick up as I watched the news all night and saw that at first there seemed to be a lot of empathy from the reporters, empathy from the media on what was developing in Los Angeles when, the uprising started. And then over time, the language and how it changed. People were being called hoodlums, as we are now, looters, hoodlums. So it's not any different. So when I listen to this and I kind of understand what I experienced as I was recording everything I was seeing on television the night that happened, and then synthesizing it into this essay, I do remember that I felt like, wow, it was so obvious to me how you could see the change in sentiment, that, everybody was being considered, we were called animals, we were called, whatever. So it's interesting now in contrast right now to what's going on and the kind of surveillance that's happening, the drones, all the different ways that we record those who are on the street, and how policemen can determine or decide to turn a camera on or off, which just happened somewhere, so.
Yeah, so there's so much to talk about. I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that you mentioned. One being how you really started with audio, with sound. And that's something that Simone Brown doesn't mention in the clip that we saw about the framing of the video and the way that, or sort of the field in which the video was read, right? And it's really important to mention that when the lawyers for the LAPD during the trial, they brought the video into the courtroom, right? And they engaged with it as aestheticians, right? They manipulated the video largely by erasing the sound. I mean, one of the things they did, they also slowed down the video. I think they zoomed in to magnify Rodney King's movements. But importantly, they presented a silent video that removed the sound of Rodney King's yells and screams, as well as the vocal and oral responses from those who were witnessing the attack, right? Which communicate quite a bit about who is being attacked and who's the aggressor. So one of the things I love about your video, your manifesto, is the way that it plays with sound, and really, the relationship between sound and visuality, which we could talk a lot about the kind of the importance, I guess, in cinema history. The importance that racial difference on screen has played to the incorporation of sound into cinema, but I'm interested in the disruptive kind of mechanisms that you deploy in the video, things like layering and delay, and this kind of disjunction between what we're seeing, on screen and what we're hearing, and then also your use of intertitles, I think, is really interesting. But I wondered if you could say a little bit more about sound and what happens, or what was happening for you as you were kind of reinserting sound, playing with the sound that had been removed by the state.
Well, there's one moment in particular that I think of, and that is when the image of Reginald Denny on the ground shifts to that of Rodney King, and you hear the commentary from the reporter in the helicopter. At that time, I was shifting away from film, and I was using both film and video. So sitting at the console and playing with the devices was really interesting and new and engaging. And I look back on it and I go, wow, did I really mean to do that? It worked well. But again, being guided by sound and hearing it in a different way, hearing the conflict of the juror speaking and what was in her mind, and then you hear the conflict of the young man on the hill kind of speaking over her at the same time, and making his voice more present as that went on. So I know that was intentional. Other things seem to just kind of flow together. The moment of the helicopter over Rodney King, that became really where the tension was for me, like, wow, look, I wanted people to see and hear and experience that. Like, at the time that he's saying there's no police presence down here. So it was a great experiment, because when I first started making film in film school, I had to almost unlearn that, like, to depend on sound, because I had to start thinking about picture. But it turned out to be a really important device. I think it really shows my identity at that time. I think I still care about sound in that way, but it was more intricate for me at that time.
So I think my last question in response to you right now just has to do with the work that you're doing right now as an educator, working with young people around community media projects. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about what you've learned over the years from your students, with your students, as you've been engaging in community media projects, I guess, about medium specificity and what's changed over the last 30 years in terms of young people's skill set, in terms of reading images. A lot of young people obviously are very adept at engaging with imagery in certain ways. And then, I think the question of framing sometimes gets left out of the picture. But, you were responding in this moment in the 1990s to television images that were, this video of Rodney King being beaten that was circulated and reproduced on television, right? And so television was the kind of specific medium through which people were learning about race, and through which Black people were being criminalized on a really mass level, right? So this is the period of intensifying expansion of the prison industry in the 1990s, right? And so, law and order campaigns, images of so-called Black criminality are everywhere. And television was kind of the main medium for the circulation of that imagery, right? And now things are different. People watch TV on the internet. And so I'm wondering if you've noticed a shift in how young people engage with images of police violence, images of anti-Blackness digitally versus televisually.
I will say that although I am considered the director of the Community Media Project, it isn't active right now. And it hasn't been for about 10 years. However, I still mentor. And so I have students who will reach out to me, sometimes teachers who reach out to me, and I will sit with a student or kind of oversee something that others are working on in community. But what's grown out of the Community Media Project, and the importance of it, is a great archive. So I've been digitizing all of the work that was done early on when I came to UWM and was given that opportunity to direct the Community Media Project, which not only was like a boots on the ground going into different neighborhoods, working with young people, but now reconnecting to them as I look at the titles and the pieces that we did and reaching out to them. So we're really planning something to have some of those students who are still young people, young adults who have families now, reconvene to look at this work. So I've been redigitized, working with the UWM library archives. They're making it available. Some of it is available on Vimeo. But the important thing is that from it was born so many other efforts that are current. So as I look around right now in this climate, there are some projects that are being done that I look at and I'm thrilled. We were offering cameras and assistance and a way for people to have the tools to tell their stories about community at the time that I started. Now we have smartphones. Now, people turn their cameras on and there's guidance. There's a couple wonderful organizations in Milwaukee that I'd like to mention. One is through UWM. It's called UWM, Documentary UWM. And it was founded by Brad Lichtenstein, who's worked with PBS, who's done some wonderful documentary work out of New York and then settled in Milwaukee. And he has a production company called 371. 371 used to be the address of the Community Media Project at UWM. The other is Truth School, which I love because Truth School is kind of a grassroots after-school program that's dealing with teens, young teens. Not only do they work in video, they do arts, all of the arts, and also music, which is amazing to me. If the Community Media Project could have expanded to that vision, I just see that now young people are using all of that to tell stories, through their music, through rap, whatever, and it's honored at Truth School. And another, which is called, let me see, I wrote it down, sorry. Urban Underground, where they tell stories about social justice. So in a way, all of these things have come to fruition and I look back on them because I've been there 28 years, so occasionally someone will come to me for guidance. What I'm dealing with right now is creating a great archive of the work that we did earlier, so.
Mm-hmm. That archiving work is so important, especially now. And I think we'll come back to this conversation about counter archiving and what it means to do this kind of community work after we hear from our other two presenters. So thank you so much, Portia.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
And I'm gonna introduce Palika Makam, who will be our next presenter. So Palika is a media activist and the US Senior Program Coordinator at Witness. She has produced video advocacy campaigns and trained activists all over the world, from Ferguson to the West Bank. At Witness, Palika leads the US immigration-focused work with Eyes on ICE, a project dedicated to supporting directly impacted communities and allies to document abuses against immigrant communities and use video to fight deportations and advocate for immigrant rights. Prior to coming to Witness, Palika co-founded and ran the Babel Project, a nonprofit that teaches youth activists to use storytelling and documentary film to advocate for their communities and specific policy change. Media she helped produce has been used as evidence in human rights abuse court cases and in advocacy campaigns around education, police violence, and immigration reform. Films have been screened everywhere from the United Nations to high school classrooms. Palika is an emerging activist fellow with the Social Change Initiative. Welcome, Palika.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you for having me. I feel very humbled to be in community with my fellow panelists, so thank you. Erin, I'm going to share my screen. If you could just let me know that you can see the slides and you can confirm that you can't see my notes, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Anything?
I can see your screen and I can't see your notes.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm just gonna get started. So I wanted to start by sharing a little bit about the organization where I work, which is called Witness. So Witness is a global human rights organization. Sorry, I just need to move something. So Witness is a global human rights organization. We support communities to use video in order to expose human rights abuses and advocate for communities. In the United States specifically, which is where I work, we're working to expose abuse by state-sanctioned actors like police, ICE, Border Patrol, prisons, detention centers, etc. We also work with public defenders and their clients to use video and storytelling as a way to support parole and clemency applications and mitigate prison sentences. So we work on a range of issues, but at the core of our work is the belief in video as a truth-telling tool, as an advocacy tool, as a tool to combat, false narratives from governments and authorities, to expose violence and patterns of abuse and galvanize communities, and most importantly, I think, is to center the stories and objectives of directly impacted communities. So we do this work through trainings, which these days are all remote and online, producing resources. We're all about accessibility. There are short resources in various languages, and we create in-depth partnerships with various organizations. And that is my contact information if you want to follow along. So I want to share a quick video to give folks a sense of what our work has looked like around the world. So Christina, if you don't mind playing the Witness clip.
This is Bore. Bore captured the cruelty of forced evictions in Cambodia, where the government has bulldozed and destroyed entire communities for profit. As thousands of people continue to fight for their homes, Bore exposes the truth behind their struggles. Meet Bukeni. Bukeni filmed children as young as 8 years old who were robbed of their childhoods and forced to become soldiers in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Bukeni's footage and advocacy helped convict militia leader Thomas Lubanga of war crimes. Lubanga is now behind bars. This is Laura. Laura helped expose the mass killings and disappearances of Mexican women and girls, whose only crime was to have been born female. Laura's story of one woman forced authorities to recognize widespread violence and to work towards a day when women don't just disappear. Mary first picked up a camera at age 60. She interviewed older men and women who suffered abuse, neglect, and exploitation, and put faces and voices to a silent crisis. Mary's interviews helped pass landmark legislation to protect vulnerable older Americans. Raja supports citizens and journalists in the Middle East who put themselves in danger to capture scenes like this one in Syria. Raja connects activists with resources they need to document the turbulence around them more safely. These activists have turned us all into witnesses. Many risk their lives to share these stories. But to honor their courage, we must do more than just witness. Join us to create a global community of activists. Help us fight human rights abuses throughout the world. Help us expose the truth, one video at a time.
So the reason why I really like that video is because many of the faces that you see in that video who were trained by Witness have since become my colleagues at Witness. So I want to just give a little bit more info about Witness, which I should have mentioned was actually founded in 1991 in the aftermath of Rodney King. So we have that kind of thread in common here. So here's a quick snapshot of where we work. One of, I think, the most valuable parts of being a part of a global team is being able to share, and learn tactics and strategies from other activists in other parts of the world using documentation as a tool. For example, in the United States, a lot of the work that we do around documenting the police has been learned from my colleagues in Brazil who are working with favela activists who have been documenting military violence for years. And currently one of my colleagues, Adebayo, is on the ground in Nigeria helping and supporting protesters to document the End SARS movement. And we've been able to be in communication about, rapid response strategies and tactics and all of that. So I think that global aspect, though we are a small team, we are mighty. And I do think that global communication just strengthens our work and calls to support Black lives around the world. So before I get more granular about my work, I wanted to just ground us in this quote by author Ta-Nehisi Coates. So, those who live in over-policed communities already know this, but for those outside of those communities, this is a really important reminder that the violence is not new, it's the cameras that are new. Video doesn't always lead to justice in or out of the courtroom, and we've seen that with so many cases of police violence here in the United States. But it does make it harder for people to deny what's happening to our communities. There's a record of what's happening, and with the current Black Lives Matter protests, we're seeing the effects of that record. People are less likely to believe media reports and police reports. And while, video is not a magic wand, if filmed and shared and preserved in a certain way in conjunction with legal strategies and advocacy strategies, it can make a real difference. And that's the work that we really focus on at Witness. So we recently, this past week actually, published a series of case studies examining the role of video from several incidents this past summer, including George Floyd's death. There's of course been a ton of coverage about this, but what we were looking for was specifically how those videos were filmed and shared to create impact, and then what lessons we could glean in order to, support and guide activists moving forward. So I just wanted to share one of those case studies. Christina, would you mind playing the next video? And I just want to give a content warning because you do see violence, police violence against a protester in this video. So if you don't want to watch that, please feel free to step away or turn off your, turn your mute button on. So this happened on May 29th of this past year during a Black Lives Matter protest in Brooklyn, New York. I was actually there this evening. And, you know, through examining the footage and articles and actually speaking with Dunya Zayer herself extensively, we were able to parse out some top line, you know, key points about how this video was filmed and shared. And I'm just going to share a few of those right now. So in one of the videos that got the most attention online, the person who tweeted actually obtained consent from Dunya before posting online. And I think this is just a really important practice to point out. You know, these videos are of real people experiencing real trauma, and it can be incredibly re-traumatizing to share a video like this recklessly online. And as community members, you know, I just think it's best practice to, if and when possible, to obtain consent for from the person, give them the footage themselves or their family members or their fellow, you know, organizers, so that they can make an informed decision about what they do with that footage. Another point that I wanted to emphasize here was the importance of having corroborating footage and having multiple angles. So there were actually 2 videos taken by a third party that were used to prove that Dunya was backing away at the moment when the officer approached her. And that footage actually confirmed that she didn't spit on the officer, which he alleged that she did. And then just the last point was that the next point that I wanted to highlight is how the video actually helped to verify some really important key details. So Dunya, in addition to other people filming, she was actually filming herself at the same time. And that footage, screenshots from that footage, were used to corroborate her story and also to help identify the officer, which was really, really huge. And a little update on the case, the officer identified who shoved her is Officer Vincent DeAndrea, and he actually ended up turning himself in a few days later after this video was shared. He's since been charged with assault and suspended without pay following the incident. He, of course, you know, like so many other police officers, has a history of allegations of excessive force against civilians. They also keep pushing his court date, which I think is just a tactic to make sure that when he's tried, the public is, you know, paying less attention. And then I also just wanted to note that we've also been working closely to support Dunya in the meantime. And, you know, she speaks often about the mental and physical, lifelong, lasting trauma that she has to live with from what happened. So just a reminder to folks that, you know, those videos are so much more than the few seconds that we see. So I'm going to switch modes and get into kind of a mini training, just to give a taste of, you know, some of the tips and tactics and strategies that I do share with activists on the ground when we are doing trainings. So obviously I can't go into too much detail because I want to be conscious of time, but I want to just share some top line best practices. So these are kind of the basic steps for documentation. So prepare, film, share, and then one that I think gets lost, but is really, really important when it comes to archiving and preserving the truth of human rights abuses is safeguarding or preserving your footage. So the first step in being prepared is knowing your rights. So I just want to give the caveat that I'm not a lawyer, and though I have, you know, filmed police, military on different continents and, you know, dive deep into this space of using video as evidence, you know, if you do have real safety legal concerns, always consult a lawyer first. That being said, in the United States, you have the right to record law enforcement in public spaces as long as you don't interfere. The don't interfere part is really crucial because what constitutes as interference is completely subjective to law enforcement. So what does this mean? It means that you can't be arrested for filming, but you can be arrested for, you know, quote unquote, obstructing justice or interfering. So that's why I tell folks that it's best to just keep a healthy distance between you and the incident. I also think it's best to generally comply with orders. If someone tells you to back up, back up. If you can even take your phone and tilt it towards your feet and film yourself complying. Dunya didn't do this exactly, but the fact that she was filming when the officer approached her helped show a record that she had complied with orders. And just a reminder that if you don't feel comfortable filming, no footage is worth your safety or the safety of the person that you're filming. The next step in preparation, and again, I'm just giving some top line facts here, is to prepare your phone. I recommend using a 6-digit passcode instead of the Face ID or Touch ID. And this is because in the United States, you have a Fifth Amendment constitutional right to not give up legal information during a legal proceeding that might incriminate you. But whether or not that protection extends to Touch ID or Face ID is currently murky. Courts have actually ruled both ways, so it just tends to be safer to use a 6-digit passcode instead. And then just the last preparation step I'm going to share is having a legal contact is always a great idea. The National Lawyers Guild has a great hotline and they're super responsive. I'm also going to mention, we'll put the link in the chat. I'm going to do a webinar, a training open to the public with an Indigenous rights group called Seeding Sovereignty next week. So if anyone is interested in diving in deeper to the more practical side, the link is going to be in the chat. So feel free to sign up for that. So moving on, an obstacle that we often see with eyewitness footage is that it's not easy to verify, meaning that it's less valuable to say, a legal case or journalist investigation. It can also then become susceptible to becoming fake news or being used out of context. For example, this is a screenshot from a video that went viral this year that claimed to be footage of a precinct being lit on fire by protesters, but it actually turned out that this was from an explosion in a city in China. Years ago, had nothing to do with the Black Lives Matter protests. And basically, we don't want this to happen to our footage. And we also want to be increasing the chances that our footage can be used for investigations, for advocacy, which is why it's important that we make sure to film and share videos in a way that increases the trustworthiness of the footage. So the two most important things to keep in mind when creating trustworthy footage is making sure that it's verifiable and relevant. So verifiable meaning that by watching the video, you can confirm that the video is what it claims to be, that it was taken at a specific time, date, and location. And relevant meaning, if you're trying to show that police used excessive force at a protest, then the video actually shows that. Or at the very least shows a piece of it, right? Because each video is a piece of the puzzle. So maybe you don't have footage of police officers using tasers, but you do have footage of the aftermath of, protesters on the ground. And that footage can still be valuable in mapping out the larger story. So I want to share some quick tips for how you can make sure that your footage can be more easily verifiable and relevant. Sorry, one moment. So first is to begin filming as soon as it's safe to do so. It's of course not easy to anticipate when, police are going to retaliate against protesters, but filming as much as you can happening on the protest grounds ensures that we have footage of what or who may have provoked the conflict. And having this can be useful in, dispelling false claims that may seek to accuse the protesters of having incited violence. Filming continuously is also really helpful. Having footage that starts and stops at different intervals can increase skepticism around the reliability of the video. It also, gives people the excuse to dismiss it and claim that it's been manipulated. You want to film the who. So you want to capture the violation, but you also want to capture the violator. So make sure you document details like the about the perpetrator, such as, the badge, uniform, type of weapon used, license plates, different identifying details, which is something Dunya Zaire did, which is why we were able to identify that police officer. You also want to establish the time, date, and location, the where and the when. So this one is super important because it helps to prove that we were where we said we were when we said we were there. So to do this, you could film a clock, landmark, weather clues, the home screen of someone's phone, the location of the sun and the clouds, overview shots. If you feel comfortable, you can say the time and date on camera, or you could also turn on your GPS location on your phone if you feel comfortable doing that as well, keeping in mind different people's risk profiles and threats of surveillance. And then just also to vary shots. We saw with the Dunya Zaire example that the fact that there were people filming from different angles as well as her own footage was helpful in telling the full story of what happened to her. That's why there are so many cop watch groups and ICE watch groups, because it can be helpful to have someone else to be filming with you. And then just the last point I'm going to share here is that if you do decide to share, with an investigator or journalist or lawyer or publicly, it can be helpful to share a detailed description in the caption or a notes document, because that can help prevent the video from being used out of context. It would also give people something to trace back to, a source to trace back to verify what they're watching. So I wish I could go into detail on strategies for sharing videos, because there's actually a lot. But for time's sake, I will just say that if you do film a video of police violence, the very first thing that you should do is pause. I know it seems counterintuitive, because we assume that, in an instantaneous 24/7 news cycle that it makes more sense to share footage right away. But actually, with a lot of the cases that we've worked with, it can be valuable to pause and take a step back and think through strategy and ethics and safety, and also to just take a breath, because you may have just witnessed a violent event or experienced a traumatic event yourself. So it's important to, take a step back and take care of yourself, and not just post it to social media immediately. So I am going to just share a few kind of considerations that you can take before you share a video. So the first, question to ask yourself is, will this video traumatize anyone? Having spoken with Dunya Zaire and worked with other people who have been victims of police violence over the years, it can be incredibly traumatizing to see a video of yourself go viral or shared in an unethical way. In 2015, I had the chance to work with Mike Brown Jr.'s family, and something that his younger sister said to me was, though they're incredibly grateful for all the love and support and camaraderie that they received from around the globe, they wish that for every day of their lives for 2 years, they didn't have to see the worst day of their lives played out on the news, on every television set. So this isn't to say that information isn't important. It's just, as ethical community members, should we be sharing this? I know Dr. Alyssa V. Richardson talks a lot about retiring videos of human rights abuses, which I think is a really important consideration. At what point do we need to stop sharing a video? So those are all things to consider. Another question is, could posting the video put me at risk? Folks are probably familiar with Ramsey Orta, who is the man from Staten Island who filmed Eric Garner being killed by police a few years ago. We actually worked with him at Witness, and he filmed his friend being killed by the police and shared that footage with the New York Daily News. And he had the option to not include his name, but he did include his name. And after that footage was published and the footage went viral, he became a target of law enforcement himself. He was being harassed. There would be unmarked cars stopping outside of his apartment, outside of his mom's apartment, and he ended up actually being arrested for quote unquote unrelated charges and serving prison time. He's actually the only person from the scene of that murder who served any prison time. So the important kind of takeaway there is that if you do film something, you don't have to have your name attached to it. You don't have to share it on your public social media channels. You can share it with a journalist, with a newspaper, with an advocacy organization, and have a layer of protection there. Another question to consider is, could posting the video put protesters who appear in the video at risk? So this is something that came up a lot with the Black Lives Matter protests from this past summer and the ongoing protests, because we know that Department of Homeland Security, police surveil protests and use that imagery as a way to target people. So before we just blindly share a video or a photo, it's important to be considering that. And there are a lot of tools that make blurring people's faces and identifying features super easy. YouTube actually has a free blurring tool. Image Scrubber has a blurring tool, and then Signal, the encrypted communication app, actually has a really super easy blurring tool for photos as well. So another thing to consider. I'm going to skip the next one and then just go to timing. So timing can be really crucial in not just sharing the video right away. We've seen multiple cases over the years, including George Floyd, where the person waited until the official police statement came out and then shared the eyewitness footage as a way to, highlight discrepancies, highlight lies. And, by waiting until the police make a statement, it doesn't give them a chance to kind of change around their story as well. So this can be a really crucial tactic and reason to hold on to your video for a beat. And then just the last thing is, where can I share my video? So some of the research that's come out of this summer is the importance of sharing videos with local journalists instead of just, you might assume that sharing it with a national outlet is the best way to go. But actually, one, an advocacy organization or a lawyer, if that's where it needs to go. But actually researching, looking at, who's covering the protests locally, who's covering police violence or surveillance locally, and then DMing them on Twitter, Instagram, emailing them. Journalists like this, they want to be found, they want this footage. So they tend to make it really easy to be able to be in contact with them. I'm just going to say a quick note about live streaming. I recognize what a powerful tool this is to garner attention and get eyes on an incident. But just want to note that with live streaming, because it's happening live, you don't have a chance to think through those considerations that I just went through. So there are some security risks with that you might want to consider before you decide to do that. And then the last thing that I'll share is archiving. So how you store and preserve this footage can be really, really important and crucial to human rights. Human rights court cases, policy change, these things are painstakingly slow. And we've worked with so many people. I've worked with so many people over the years who, ended up needing footage that they filmed or, captured from a decade ago. And if it's not shared and preserved in a certain way, it could hurt its chances of being used for justice or even being used as evidence in a court case. So just the very bare bones explanation here is I like to share something called the 3-2-1 rule. So if you have filmed something of human rights value, you want to make at least 3 copies of it, save it on 2 different types of storage, meaning, like your hard drive, your computer, or, your computer at your office or computer at home. And then you want to try to have at least 1 offsite copy, so not everything's in the same place. And then just the last thing, if you are going to edit, if you're going to blur faces, add text, titles, whatever, do that from a copy, never edit the original file. So I'm gonna leave folks, oh, and just a reminder that social media is not an archive. We've worked with so many activists from Syria to the United States, Ferguson, who have had their content taken down from social media platforms and lost forever. So YouTube is not a proper archive. So I'm gonna leave y'all with that kind of very quick mini training here and just share that Witness has a ton of resources. Here's a video of me at a Black Lives Matter protest giving tips in real time. So if you're at a protest and you want to, sorry, I didn't mean to play that. We have all these tip sheets. We have this really great decision tree. So if you have filmed a video of police violence, it actually takes you through the questions and helps you kind of decide what you should do with it. So I think there's going to be a link to that in the chat, so encourage folks to check that out. And if you want to follow me or Witness, here's all of our information. And please think of me as a resource. Reach out to my email if anything is relevant. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Palika. I learned a lot about Witness Media Lab this week. I spent some time on the website, and I really want to encourage people to visit Witness's website. the resources that Palika has mentioned are there, and there are so many other ones. If you're at all interested in, like I, for example, have been interested in filming evictions of homeless communities, houseless encampments here in the Bay Area. But I've often been like, well, I don't really know how to do it. And I realized that Witness Media Lab actually has all the tools I need to begin doing cop watching in that way. And the other really exciting, I mean, it's not just that the tools are there, but that you and your colleagues have presented them to the public in a really intentional way that really amplifies the importance of storytelling and collaboration. And so I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing. And I'm really excited for the workshop that you're going to give next week. So I have a question about storytelling and the Cop Watch in Sunset Park and your collaborations with Cop Watch in Berkeley. I wonder if you could just speak briefly about what else, I guess, what some of the differences are between community-based surveillance of the police, community-based cop watching, and then the footage that we get from police body cameras, right? Because I think a lot of people, they think that police body cameras are showing what we need to see, but you actually outline a totally different approach to framing and sharing this work, and I think it's really important that people understand the full kind of field in which activists are mobilizing, documentary evidence-based footage, and then what other kinds of relations can occur through that kind of community collaboration.
Yeah, I think with body cameras at a very just literal level, it's a camera, it's on the police officer's body. It's another camera to surveil you, to surveil us. It's not holding them accountable. And then, from how it's been implemented, the policies are different. I think Portia already mentioned that the kind of the gaps there are with policies and implementing body cams. Sometimes officers don't turn them on. Sometimes that footage gets lost. Sometimes, it's oftentimes the footage isn't available to the public. So it's really not another tool for transparency. It's not a tool for transparency at all, which is why it's so important that community members are filming. And with the work that we do with Cop Watch groups like El Grito, that's the Sunset Park, and with Berkeley Cop Watch in California, has been to really take the videos that both these groups are, they've been cop watching for decades, like way before smartphones. And a lot of the work that we did with them is to take this incredible archive of evidence, of video that they've collected for years and years, and to create a database around it so that they could start pulling out those patterns, especially in New York City, before Section 50A was repealed, we don't know what officers have, repeat violations or complaints against them. So that kind of information is so important, and that information comes from the community. So being able to work with groups like that and organize and archive and turn their work into a database so that we can pull out those patterns is so important. And something that I really learned through doing this database work was that, there's such like an elitist idea of what constitutes evidence, and for lack of a better term, bulletproof evidence. And it's rarely the footage or the stories or the information that come from people in the community. And that's kind of part of our work with groups like this, is trying to kind of topple that elitist idea of whose truth and whose stories and whose footage is actually considered evidence. And yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna turn it over to our last presenter now, and then I'll ask some more questions afterwards that you can all discuss together. So I'm excited to welcome Imani Jacqueline Brown, who is an artist, activist, and researcher from New Orleans, and currently based in London. Her work investigates the continuum of extractivism, which spans from settler colonial genocide and slavery to contemporary gentrification, fossil fuel production, and police and corporate impunity. These investigations expose the layers of violence and resistance that comprise the foundations of US society and imagine a future of ecological reparations. Imani is a researcher with forensic architecture and an economic inequality fellow with Open Society Foundations. She received her MA from the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths, University of London in 2019. Welcome, Imani.
Hi, thanks. Can you see me, sort of?
I can see you, yeah.
Hi, Erin. Thanks so much. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be here with you all, with Portia, with you, with Palika. So I'm here to speak a bit about forensic architecture, which is an interdisciplinary research agency based at Goldsmiths, University of London. And we undertake spatial and media analysis for international prosecutors, human rights groups, and NGOs. Our research is presented in political and legal forums, as well as in exhibitions and public events, truth commissions, people's tribunals, courts, and human rights reports. But we can also say that forensic architecture is a counter-forensic agency. So what does that mean? So forensics, or forensic science, is a state practice of securing, cordoning off, and culling evidence from the scene of a crime. This evidence is used to identify a suspect and to detain, charge, sentence, and punish them. The field of forensic science provides a set of analytic tools that the state uses to recreate the dynamic spatial, material, and temporal conditions of this crime. The benefits of forensics are disproportionately allocated across lines of race and class. And this project of forensics is said to be a part of the package of powers that we hand over to the state in the so-called social contract. So what happens when the state itself is the perpetrator of crime, which, as we all know, is often the case? A practice of counterforensics attempts to hand these powers back to the people, back into the civic sphere. But of course, counterforensics does not have the financial resources, nor the privileges of access afforded to the state. And it is, of course, the state that sets the rules of evidence and court procedure. So counterforensics has to find its own ways of accessing the so-called crime scene, has to find ways to puncture the cordon, so to speak. And for a practice of counterforensics to work, we need to innovate different methods to locate and analyze evidence. We need to present our evidence within forums that are outside of the state's sphere of influence, in public and community forums. And we need to subvert our disadvantages in judicial forums. So how do we do this? So as has been discussed over the course of this panel, the saturation of smartphones and social media has placed cameras and public platforms in the hands of far more people than ever before. This enables the populace to turn the forensic gaze back onto the state. So what tools do we have that the state doesn't have? Well, we have the power of distributed yet dense movements. We have the benefit of collective experience in designing alternative systems. And we have access to people's history. I'm using a collective we in this sense. So historical and political consciousness is the critical tool to puncture the cordon around the crimes of the state. These lenses are essential to unpacking instances of police brutality and seeing them not as isolated incidents, but as part of a continuum, a carefully maintained system of racialized state violence and repression. So I'm going to show clips from 2 investigations into police killings of Black people. And so I also need to give a content warning and an apology to be showing this footage. So the first is from the investigation into the killing of Mark Duggan. So on August 4th of 2011, a 29-year-old Mark Duggan was shot to death in London by police after undercover officers pulled over the minivan he was traveling in. The officers involved in the shooting claimed to have seen a gun in his hand, yet the gun was found in the grass a full 7 meters away from where he was shot. Duggan's family filed a civil suit against the Metropolitan Police Department, and their lawyers commissioned forensic architecture to investigate. So I'd like to show a clip from our investigative film, which uses open source video footage in order to evidence alternatives to the state's claims that Duggan had thrown the gun prior to his shooting. So can we cue the clip, please? Thank you.
But these statements are misleading. Let's take a look at the first claim. Witness B's footage is very low resolution. Would it even be possible to see a gun in the footage at this distance? We introduced a model of a gun into the scene. Then we applied filters to recreate the resolution of the footage, demonstrating that the gun wouldn't be visible in the video at this distance. However, the footage does show us how the officers moved around the scene. So we can examine the IPCC's claim that there is no evidence that any officer entered the rear of the minicab. Witness B's footage is shaky, so first we stabilize the video so that stationary objects like the cars stay in the same place in the frame. This made it easier to identify individual officers and to track their movements around the scene. We assigned a code name to each officer until we could work out who they are. For example, the officer known as Q63 is identifiable because of his white t-shirt. Then we mapped the areas that would have been hidden from Witness B's camera. When officers drop out of sight within this red zone, behind the minicab and Charlie car, they could potentially have entered the minicab and retrieved the gun. We tracked how Q63 moved around the scene. Whenever he is partly or fully hidden in the red zone, his track turns red. Whenever he is visible, the track is white. We turned this tracking into a timeline and repeated this process for each of the other officers. This meant we could see when any officer was partly or fully hidden behind the minicab and Charlie car. In total, officers entered this zone more than a dozen times, but the IPCC did not examine these moments in any detail. These moments don't tell us that the gun was moved by police officers, but they do show that, based on the footage alone, the IPCC has no grounds to rule out the possibility that any officers entered the rear of the minicab. We mapped dozens of possible chains of connections by which the gun could hypothetically have been carried from the minicab to the grass. Here is a demonstration of one of them.
So sorry, we have to stop there. The film is a full 22 minutes and it is on our website, forensic-architecture.org. But it goes on to track the movements of the officers. And ultimately our conclusions were twofold. First, that Duggan could not have been holding a gun at the time that he was shot. And second, that we could not exclude the possibility that the officers had themselves removed the gun from the minivan and planted it in the grass. Ultimately, however, we will never know what happened because the officers involved were not documenting one another. So the Metropolitan Police Department settled with the Duggan family, and policy changes were made at the national level, mandating that UK police wear body cameras. So seemingly a win for police accountability activists and advocates. Unfortunately, a Guardian article from just earlier this month reveals that Scotland Yard has decided not to routinely release its own video footage of controversial incidents after internal reviews have showed that errors have often been made by their officers. So of course, such errors are exactly what body cameras are designed to reveal. So let's look now at a second recent case, this time one with body cameras involved. And this is an investigation into the killing of Harith Augustus. So on July 14th of 2018, 37-year-old Harith Augustus was killed by police on the south side of Chicago. And forensic architecture was contacted by the Invisible Institute, who brought us onto their case. So one of the key questions in our investigation was how the temporality of cognition bears on the decision to shoot. So in other words, the so-called split-second decision. So using footage from police body cams, as well as one dashboard cam, we recreated the incident using 3D modeling. So could we cue that clip as well, please?
We estimated the time range at which Dylan Halley decided to pull the trigger. The total time from a simple visual stimulus to an action is about 300 milliseconds. A possible breakdown is the following. It would take roughly 50 milliseconds for a finger to pull the trigger. It would take about another 50 milliseconds for the command to travel from the brain to the muscles to pull the trigger. It would take 100 milliseconds to process the decision to shoot. Finally, it can take between 100 to 400 milliseconds to parse and understand visual information. When Halley started the process of shooting, Augustus is somewhere between this and this position, with his back turned to the police. It is impossible to ascertain whether Augustus is trying to pull the gun, as police claim, or steady it while turning. Professor Tiago Branco described Dylan Halley's process.
The question is, was the shooter reacting to any particular event that led him to press the trigger? That you might call a split-second decision if you want. Though I think the term is actually a bit misleading because it comes on the back of this escalation, essentially, which in this model of decision-making would be you're already pretty close to your threshold, and then you just need a little something else to take you over the threshold.
We analyzed the succession of actions and reactions that led to the shooting. At 5:30, 36 seconds, 19 frames, Megan Fleming, Dylan Halley, and Danny Tan had cornered Augustus, causing the situation to escalate and the threat levels to rise. At 5:30, 38 seconds, 3 frames, we see Dylan Halley's right hand without a gun. Augustus then broke Megan Fleming's grip on his shirt, causing his shirt to lift, exposing his gun. While Augustus was trying to escape Fleming's hold, we see Halley had pulled his gun and was pointing it towards Augustus. The gun was within Augustus's field of vision. Augustus had his back turned towards Dylan Halley while running in the opposite direction. At the same time, Halley cleared Fleming's hand from his line of fire and steadies his gun with both hands, preparing to shoot. Only then did Augustus's right hand move towards his gun holster. At 5:30, 40 seconds, Augustus's escape path was blocked by a patrol vehicle, causing him to brake and turn. This abrupt turn might have been the final trigger for Halley's decision to shoot. While stopping and turning, his hand touched his gun once more. 9 frames later, at 5:30, 40 seconds, 29 frames, with the police patrol vehicle clear of the line of fire, Halley fired the first shot. 7 frames later is the second shot. 6 frames after that, the third. 7 frames later, the fourth. 2 seconds and 4 frames after the first shot, Halley fired a 5th shot. The shot was taken when Augustus's body had already fallen to the ground. The recently released dashcam footage shows that, in fact, after the 4th shot, Halley took another 2 steps, reassessed, aimed, and fired for the last time.
It's possible maybe he made the call here that I'm going to shoot 4 times. What's weird is the 5th one. this is very, very similar, and this is maybe a little bit shorter, but they're very regular. It's basically determined by the kinetics of the actual finger movement, right? So I think that it makes sense to think about this as one action, but this then as a separate action that required a second, more conscious decision, if you want.
So forensic architecture's investigation prompted public demands for the release of additional footage. And this footage shows, in part, the officers articulating their fear of Augustus, perhaps aware that the body cams provide them with an opportunity to, quote, evidence their own innocence. This case also raises questions about the perspectival bias of body cams, as Palika addressed, which encourage the viewer to empathize with the wearer, the officer. So in one portion of this clip and elsewhere in the video, we use lines of sight in a humble attempt to approximate the perspective of Herod Augustus, who is, of course, unable to represent his own perspective. The male voice we hear in the video is that of a neuroscientist and expert on the temporality of instinctive decisions and response times. So he says the fifth shot is weird. The second deliberate action taken after Augustus was already on the ground. Why did he shoot him so deliberately again? And was that last movement really the trigger that led the officer to fire, or was that decision made sometime prior to that point? Beyond digging into the logics of the split-second decision, this case opens onto the rash of police murders of Black Americans through the firing of 5, 11, 16 bullets. And it therefore begs a further question. Beyond the temporality of cognition, how does cognitive bias bear on the decision to shoot or deploy other forms of force? Can counterforensics evidence the structural dimensions of both police violence and unaccountability? Can it evidence the racism that operates largely beneath the threshold of visibility? So I'd like to cue the last and final video, please.
Following the killing of George Floyd, nationwide protests against police brutality toward Black Americans have themselves been met with widespread and egregious violence by police. Forensic architecture and Bellingcat have verified and located video evidence of this violence and placed it within an interactive platform, totaling over 1,000 incidents from 43 states. This archive evidences the claims made by dozens of organizations that have publicly denounced the ongoing brutality, including UN experts, who demanded an independent inquiry into systemic racism and state-sponsored racial violence. The platform lets us categorize the data in different ways, such as when officers use tear gas, pepper spray, or so-called less lethal rounds, and explore patterns of abuse across time and space, such as attacks against medics, which we have so far identified in at least 7 states. Here in Austin, for example, individuals clearly marked with red crosses are carrying a visibly wounded man when officers opened fire on them. While medics were physically assaulted by police officers in New York and in Portland. The platform also reveals nearly 200 attacks against journalists, such as here in Los Angeles, where a reporter is brutally thrown to the ground and arrested. The scale of these attacks points to a systematic disregard for fundamental press freedoms. In Philadelphia, an officer uses pepper spray on civilians who are clearly not resisting, in direct violation of his department's own policies. while here in Los Angeles, we see officers escalating a standoff, firing hundreds of less lethal rounds at retreating protesters, making no effort to de-escalate as required by policy. Out of this data emerges a picture of police departments that behave more like paramilitaries than public servants. Some jurisdictions, including New York City, Virginia, and Colorado, have responded to this lawlessness by passing police reform legislation. But videos from the months since those bills passed show that they have so far failed to rein in the violence. A more common response was to further vilify protesters and empower police through state of emergency declarations that restrict civilians' right to protest. Across the country, hundreds of curfew orders created zones of exception, which encourage and legitimize violence. Including attacking civilians on private property. And kettling protesters to stop them from leaving before using violence against them. The platform presents evidence for this kind of kettling in at least 8 states. Other jurisdictions, such as Rochester, New York, have permitted their officers to hide their identities. Here in Portland, a similar anonymity has given federal agents license to operate like secret police.
What is going on? Who are you?
Abductions like these are not the only instances of Portland's residents being subjected to authoritarian violence by unaccountable federal agents. In September, for example, Portland banned local police from using tear gas, but the city could not prevent federal agents from continuing to use it in their streets. Here we see local officers, identifiable by their arm patches, using the cover of these attacks to make sweeping arrests. Their gas masks suggest that they were cooperating with federal agencies, despite their public denials. Federal agents in Portland have also deployed grenades containing hexachloroethane, a hazardous waste chemical, and a likely human carcinogen. In September, local police were even deputized as federal agents in response to a rally by a far-right hate group, the Proud Boys. That rally, which included many individuals armed and wearing military gear, was clearly policed more gently than the city's militarized response to recent Black Lives Matter protests. Our data shows that this double standard is common across the country. When heavily armed, white supremacist militias gathered in Louisville, Kentucky in early September, police presence was minimal. Compare that to the response of officers in the same city to a Black Lives Matter protest later that month. In Olympia, Washington, an officer smiles and poses with a militia group. While in Salem, Oregon, an officer gives advice to a militia group about how to stay out of trouble after curfew.
So we don't look like we're playing favorites.
By comparison, in Richmond, Virginia, officers tear-gassed a Black Lives Matter protest around 20 minutes before curfew began. The available evidence clearly points to a systemic crisis in policing.
Please don't shoot us!
We and our partners will continue to analyze these patterns of abuse in support of legal action and movement demands for abolition.
So the video that we've just watched introduces Time Map, which is an open source interactive mapping platform that was created by our team. And the platform was launched yesterday. So it's intended to document and communicate the state's brutal response to widespread demands that the state and its agents be held to account for their crimes. So when you navigate it, you'll see that each incident has been tagged according to the victimized individual, the type of violence deployed, and the munitions, or tactics used. But you'll also notice that no videos are themselves hosted on our server. So only when the video of an incident has been widely shared do we link to the original social media post. This means that if either the author or the subject pulls the footage from online, our platform will fall in line with their decision. So while the wide and easy availability of open source evidence makes counterforensics practices like FAs possible, it also makes it necessary to ensure that our strategy is dynamic, responsive, self-critical, and most importantly, developed in collaboration with a wide range of stakeholders. So we have put together an ethical praxis through consultation with activists, advocates, lawyers, and journalists. And I'm gonna skip the ethical and safety considerations that we went through because Palika did such a thorough and amazing job at doing that. But I will say that we also need to balance these ethical and safety concerns with the need to retain this material as evidence for use in legal action. As such, the material evidence in our platform is presently securely held within Goldsmiths University's servers, according to archiving best practices. So in addition to serving as a public archive, this platform allows us to place individual incidents in the context of broader patterns across space and time. So over the next months, we'll be working with activists, independent police monitors, human rights organizations, and legal firms to investigate individual incidents, in many cases employing the techniques that we used in the Duggan and Augustus investigations. And we'll ask some deeper questions, such as whether counterforensics can expose the individual and structural racial prejudice that precipitates physical violence against Black people, as well as against movement groups that demand the redress of systemic racism. And to dig into this question, we'll be working with graduate researchers in public history to draw lines of sight through history to today's brutality. They are going to help us to build in these deeper dimensions of policy and history into Time Map, exposing how the state's efforts to suppress, for example, the civil rights movement enables police surveillance and unaccountability, as well as state repression today, as well as with declarations of states of emergency, unlawful assembly, riot, and curfew orders, as well as deputization of police, all of which have been seen, all of which were seen both in Selma, Alabama in March 1965, as well as in Portland, Oregon in September 2020. Or with qualified immunity, a Kafkaesque legal doctrine introduced in 1967, widely used today, which prevents individuals whose constitutional rights have been violated from suing the police if the circumstances of their case don't exactly match an existing fact pattern. This doctrine is thus codifying police impunity. And we will question, along with activists, whether given this context, we can even consider reform as effective or possible. If we examine the foundations of policing in the US, as Erin did in the introduction, we can see that it's grounded in slave patrols, and that the power of the police to use deadly force was first deployed against Bras Coupé, a Maroon who escaped enslavement and evaded slave catchers in New Orleans and became a legend. So examining today's wanton use of so-called less lethal force holds a mirror to our nation's emaciated efforts to redress structural racism. So all this historical and political context is a lens that brings focus to the permissiveness of some officers toward white supremacist militia groups. Because while they claim to protect and serve all Americans, their true allegiance is to the racialized status quo. So in conclusion, as we endeavor to support movement demands for accountability, defunding, and abolition, we need to critically question the tools we use, always sitting cautiously within Audre Lorde's caution that the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. So while counterforensics will not in itself dismantle racism, perhaps it can help to evidence its persistence and its proliferation. It can be one of the tools to demand accountability, which could be one step along the road to the transformation of state power. And in the short term, it can help to transform members of the public who encounter it into police abolitionists. So I'll just conclude by saying that we are actively seeking additional partners and collaborators on this ongoing investigation. So please do feel free to reach out to me. My email is ijb@forensic-architecture.org if you think that our methodology can be of use to you, your group, or your organization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Imani. I'm so excited that you're working with Forensic Architecture. It's an organization that I've been following for some years, and I also really value the intentionality and care that you and your colleagues put into, the work that you're doing and how you present it to the public, and how you call people into the work with you. And I guess I'll just invite, I'll say first of all that we are behind. We're running a little bit late, and we're virtual now, so we can just stay where we are and keep rolling. If you're able to stay with us, we'll continue talking for another 15 minutes or so. And I'd like to invite all of our panelists and presenters to rejoin us, just so I can see you. Thank you. And so I just wanted to start off our discussion by noting that, all of our presentations tonight have really demonstrated that evidence doesn't speak for itself, right? That documentation is a practice of knowledge production, right? The pattern, the attention to patterning, the attention to learning to read this material, the data, the imagery, etc., that Witness Media Lab and Forensic Architecture engage is really important, right? So documentation is a practice of knowledge production and the creation of shared realities, right? And we might recall Boots Riley's commentary in Portia's film that, what did he say? He reminded us that we can't, and I'm speaking about Black people, we can't define ourselves by how much we're oppressed, right? So we're not just our trauma, we're also fugitivity and refusal, and creation, invention. And he says in Portia's video that power is the ability to define reality and to have others heed to that definition, right? So we're in an era of deep fakery, and alarming statements of fact that, of course, are not statements of fact. And this is a weapon that 45 has been wielding, with unbelievable power for the last 4 years or so. And so I wanted to ask our panelists, well, actually, I just wanted to mention, following Imani's presentation, that folks in the audience should definitely go and watch the material on the Forensic Architecture website. The video that Forensic Architecture produced about the killing of Michael Duggan in the UK. I don't think that this part was shown, maybe it was, Imani, but if you watch the whole video, you'll get a better sense of the gap, right, in the video that Forensic Architecture uncovered, right, because the surveillance footage had been edited so that we weren't supposed to see the police officer throwing the gun. And so Forensic Architecture, because you're spending so much time with this material, learning to read it, engaging in a kind of deliberate, really close reading of the material, you were able to recognize that there was a piece missing from this footage. So, your Forensic Architecture is in the business of doing counter investigations, catching these gaps, catching these errors and misreadings, right, in the conclusions reached by state officials in their handling of the footage and the data and the conclusions that they come to. And so I'm wondering if all of you could say a little bit about the role of imagination and speculation and uncertainty in the work that you're engaging in. And maybe a little bit about because Imani, you mentioned that this cognitive bias is not something that we can just purely evidence, right? We're sort of in this field of cognitive bias, right? And not all of it is visible or legible. It's beneath, these are your words, a threshold of visibility. So as we're moving forward and thinking about ways to turn the camera back on the state, I think it's also really important to highlight, abolitionist vision, right? And also making visible other ways of being, other ways of caring for each other, making visible the kind of networks of mutual aid that have long existed and are becoming more powerful in this moment. So maybe you could talk a little bit about speculation, imagination as part of this kind of larger vision for social change.
Were you asking me to start?
I'm asking all of you. Whoever wants to go first can jump in.
Well, I guess, to just say something about, you started by speaking about the era of deepfakes, and which I guess we could say, are operating in this sort of space of imagination and fantasy, right? But certainly causing everyone to call into question what the truth is. And one thing, that's interesting about, I guess, this moment, the like post-truth era that as it's been called, is that of course we know that the state has always fabricated its own version of the truth, right? We know that history is a fabricated version of existence, right? And so one of the things that forensic architecture tries to do is bring other strands of the truth, bring other strands of existence, of perception, of possibility, of reality, sort of like into the visual register, and speculate exactly, as you're saying, what, if we can't fully trust, right, the evidence as presented, can we run through all of the various, can we run through various possibilities? Can we sit with possibility a little bit longer? And I think this, this type of practice is, one way of trying to combat this relationship of the split second, right? This temporal relationship with our relations with one another, right? Where we're told that the police have to make these life or death decisions within a split second, and therefore foreclose on the possibility of other types of interactions, preempt the possibility of other types of interactions, of de-escalation, of communication with individuals, right?
Yeah, and police rely so heavily on this notion of what they call reasonable fear, right? Which is what they say pops up in that instant, in that moment, in the instant in which they reflexively, without thinking, perhaps, reach for a gun and shoot. And I'm thinking about, in Portia's film, the attention to time and the rhythmic, right? You counting in the background the number of times Rodney King was hit by the batons and the number of times people watched the video, but you're also calling into question, the idea that harm is something that we always see, right? And what I really sensed in watching your video, Portia, was your attention to the kind of, I guess, rhythmic, the kind of fashioning of everyday life. The kind of rhythm of everyday life is just saturated with this kind of violence, even when we don't see it. So I think it's the white hand of justice that you named in the film, the person drumming on the table, drumming against this kind of seemingly empty table, right? But there's so much that image and sound of a rhythmic beat, calls to mind so many things, including the ways that people counter this kind of violence, with different forms of creative life making, but ultimately that there's so much more to what we're seeing, and so memory becomes really important, and what Christina Sharp calls wake work, right? So that what you're providing people with is not just something to look at as a kind of mimetic reproduction of reality, but really getting people to engage creatively with the formation of the real. I wonder if Portia and Palika have any thoughts that have come to mind regarding speculation, imagination, time, the unseen.
Oh.
Go for it, go for it.
Sorry. As I was watching those two pieces and thinking about the idea of witnessing, and witnessing would have been allowing someone to speak, or someone, a journalist pointing a microphone at you and asking you to, say something. By the time I began teaching teens in neighborhoods in Milwaukee, and bringing the community media project to them, what they wanted to witness through the lens were things that were going on in their neighborhoods that were harmful to them. And we didn't have any other way but to have them say a statement, then go into a liquor store, buy the liquor, come back, and then have them kind of tell us what happened inside. So I see so much else going on now, especially with 3D and ways of remapping. And I know that as I look back on what I did, I felt like to give someone a chance to speak and to kind of bring it forward. But what I'm leaving with today is how witnessing has changed so much, and how we still have to stay in front of it. We have to still stay in front of it, even with all the tools that we have. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Palika?
Yeah, I think that just the one thing I'll add here is, at Witness, deepfakes and those kind of like emerging threats is definitely something that we're thinking about. I always try to come from a place of power, not paranoia, like prepare, don't panic. There's no reason to be grounding our communities in more paranoia, but there is a reason to have some healthy skepticism there. And, it's been really interesting because for years at Witness, Witness has been around since the early 90s. And for years at Witness, our tagline was seeing is believing. And not only is that ableist, but it's also being completely nuanced by this whole, like post-truth era and deep fakes. And so, a lot of what we've been focusing on in our trainings with activists around the world is how to, how to make sure that your footage can be more easily verifiable, looking at metadata, things like that. And then just from like a imagination perspective, so we have, I have colleagues at Witness who have been working on this and have actually been holding convenings around deep fakes and emerging threats with activists in Malaysia and in South Africa. And we have one coming up in the United States after the election. And I think the part that I'm really interested in for this session is we're going to have a whole session, and I wish we'd already had it because then I could share some of those learnings, but we're going to have a whole session around like the potential of deep fakes for good. I know that there's been some like exploration. I don't know much about the film, Welcome to Chechnya. I know that there's been some controversy over the filmmaker and co-opting Marsha P. Johnson's story. But I know that in that film, which is, I think, looking at anti-LGBTQ violence in Chechnya, they actually use deepfakes as a way to anonymize people. And then, this convening that we're going to be having with activists is also going to be looking at like, so how can we take this technology and potentially use it as part of our storytelling and our advocacy work, which I think is always really cool to imagine something more creative and exciting.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really, really impressed with the way that all of you are reframing Witness as a form of political participation and even de-escalation. I mean, I think that's language that Witness uses on its website, right? Really getting people to not just think that, flipping open their phone and turning it on is gonna, that's the work, right? That actually it's a participatory action, and I think that that's something that has taken a long time for people to learn. So we've got a question from an audience member who has a question for Portia. Portia, do you see your video as an archive, is the question.
I do, but I love that it is current again, and I love that it can be seen as a reference. It definitely is an archive for me when I look back on how it was made, the method of making, the materials that I used. but I also realized that for me, it helped me to have my boots on the ground in that way. So I do see it as an archive. I'm trying to figure out how to keep it as pure as I can, although I've tried to digitize it and make it look better. I think it looked pretty good tonight. And I hope that people will use it and write about it and continue to address what was going on then and what is happening now and what will be happening in the future.
Thank you. So it is 8:30 now on the East Coast, 5:30 here in California. I don't want to hold people up if you have to go, but I have more questions, and I also want to give our presenters an opportunity to pose questions to each other, or just talk through, think through things that have come to mind in the presentations tonight. So Christian, is it okay if we spend a little bit more time together, or should we call it?
I think we should just keep rolling, and if anyone in the audience needs to go, as I said earlier, this is being recorded, so you don't feel bad about leaving a Friday night. So I think we should continue a bit. Sure. I actually had one question for Imani, because when I saw this new video and the platform, I was struck by how different it is from many of the other forensic architecture investigations, or at least I think many people associate forensic architecture with a single case and kind of deep, detailed investigation into one case. But here is something kind of new, right? It's taking a broader and more structural, so to speak, structural look at video. So I was wondering if you had a discussion of this, before deciding to do this platform, if you perhaps had in mind first just going for one particular case instead of doing this platform, or yeah.
So I'll try to answer that. Those discussions happened before I was brought on to forensic architecture. But as I understand it, well, here's the history. So one of our very close partners on the project is Bellingcat, which is an open source investigative journalist organization, also an international organization. And they started to geolocate and archive incidents of police brutality at the Black Lives Matter protests at some point in the summer. Once they started to do that, forensic architecture, we've partnered with Bellingcat a few times in the past. Forensic architecture saw that work and jumped in saying, hey, we have this software called Time Map that allows this sort of deeper analysis, because it allows for mapping across time, so in 4 dimensions rather than just across space in 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions. And so, yeah, that partnership kind of shored up. The decision was to start with the data. And, once we start to understand, the scope, the scale, that we would then, identify individual incidents that we're going to spend more time with. So we have a few of those sort of brewing. It's a little too early to really speak about it, but we will be analyzing specific incidents involving, tear gas deployment, sort of like wanton use, indiscriminate use of tear gas, trying to understand the environmental consequences, the public health consequences, the way the tear gas is impacting surrounding communities, right? That it's not just impacting people who are in the streets, not that that would make it okay, but that it's seeping into people's homes. We're looking at incidents of kettling, hopefully supporting a class action lawsuit where 150 people were kettled, prevented from leaving, and then sort of tormented and brutalized over the course of 45 minutes. Yeah, and so we're also trying to see the way that we can keep building this sort of bird's eye view at the same time and going deeper, as I mentioned, with the public history work. So yeah, we're exploring lots of different ways. Sorry, I see a question. Kettling is essentially when police, it's a strategy of blocking egress from a specific area, right? So police can use, sometimes they'll just stand in formation across, all of the streets in an intersection. Sometimes they'll use bikes or other types of blockades, and sometimes they'll use kind of rain of munitions, walls of tear gas in order to prevent people from moving. And it basically traps people in one space. It prevents them from being able to respond to dispersal orders, and therefore subjects them to arrest and legitimizes their arrest.
Yeah, and maybe if people are interested, I mean, as Erin said, you should all go to the website to see the platform. But could you say something about the project? Will it continue? This is phase 2 of a larger project, right? Will you have future releases or something like that?
Certainly. So yeah, we're, as I mentioned, we're starting to look into specific incidents to that merit deeper analysis. Excuse me, language is starting to fall apart at 12:30. We'll definitely be working on this for quite some time. We're looking to support some legal action, and legal action has a very long timeline. So there will certainly be further public releases. I can't give you a date for any of that yet. We're also, continuing to monitor the situation along with Bellingcat and our volunteers. As the uprising continues, as the repression of the uprising continues over these next months, we're continuing to monitor, and time map is being constantly updated. So.
Yeah, I think the question that you raise around going forward, and we're only going to continue to need these tools, right, and to continue to learn how to use them really carefully. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on or tips for folks who are, we're all concerned about the election and voter intimidation, the presence of white supremacist militias at the polls. And I wonder if Forensic Architecture or Witness Media Lab is doing any work to document what's happening at the polls right now.
We're not doing a ton of active work around it, but we do have a resource, which I can put in the chat if you want to share it with folks, on what to document, like what voter intimidation looks like, and then what to document and how to do it. You're generally not allowed to bring your phone or camera into a polling place. So the tips are more for outside of a polling place. So yeah, I'm going to put that in the chat right now.
Thank you. Yeah, we're not actively monitoring. We're not doing poll watch. All of the footage that we're gathering is open source from social media, although we do, and this is notable, we do have a submissions page on our website. So if folks are not comfortable putting their footage on social media, but want it to be included in the platform or the archive, there is a secure submission form that can be anonymous. And data is protected by very kind of high European data protection standards. But this raises the point that we've been trying to figure out what is the scope of the platform, right? Because of course the protests began, and remain, Black Lives Matter protests against police violence against Black people and other people of color. They expanded to anti-ICE incidents, right, which anti-ICE protests, which we consider to be a part of that same scope. And we wonder, you know, like what will happen if there are subsequent protests after the election? Should we consider those as well to be challenging ultimately white supremacy, right? The white supremacist structure of the US. So anyway, so you ask about poll watching. So I think it would be interesting for us to consider what to do with footage that, you know, of incidents that take place, you know, on election day and at the polls. So something to take back with me. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm also wondering what work you've been involved in, or just, you know, maybe you can sort of talk loosely about the lack of public access to, you know, body camera footage, the state's data collections, and then police personnel files. Like what limits do you come up against, or what difficulties have you experienced when trying to access, you know, this knowledge produced by the state? And, you know, I guess, what have you seen recently in terms of activists trying to make requests for police data?
If that's to me, I'm afraid I won't be able to answer that. So the two cases that did use body cam and dash cam footage predated me, and I don't have that type of detailed information, unfortunately.
I don't know if Palika's still with us. I think she might be eating dinner. And I forgot that you are, I didn't forget, but I just remembered when you mentioned that it's 12:30 in London. So I think unless we have another question from the audience or from Christian or from one of our panelists, we'll probably end here. Does anybody else have any burning questions they want to pose right now?
Someone did ask about saving the chat with the information in it.
Oh.
Yes, so I just heard back from Ina now. So yes, the chat will be saved. I'm not sure we can have it live after as this person asked, but we will save it after. So the host of the Zoom session can save the chat. And so we'll share that if you go to the events page on the Cinema Studies website and on Facebook. You can see the links again. Okay, so yeah, I think it makes sense, Erin, to wrap up unless anyone has anything to add. But I just wanted to say thank you again so much for participating, and thank you all for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christian, for convening us. It was really great to see you again. I met Christian in a graduate seminar that I co-taught with Nick Mirzoff a couple of years ago in media, culture, and communication. So it's great to be back in touch with Christian, and really wonderful to get to speak with our three presenters tonight. I'm excited to continue learning from all of you, and I might be in touch about projects going forward. So thanks for sharing your work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.